Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good night, good morning. Welcome to this book talk about city-state constitutionalism and the megacity by Herschel. This book talk is organized by the University of Melbourne, by the IACL Group on New Frontiers of Federalism, by the University of Maryland, and by the University of Milan. I'm really grateful to my co-convener, Erika, Arban, and Mark Graeber for having organized this book talk. And I'm also extremely happy to have such an outstanding commentators. We have Professor Adrian Stone, Kathleen Fitzpatrick, Australian Laureate Fellow, and Redmond Berry Distinguished Professor and Director of the Center for Comparative Constitutional Studies at the University of Melbourne. We have Professor Mark Graeber, University System of Maryland Regents Professor, and Professor Tarun Kaitan, Professor of Public Law and Legal Theory and Vice Dean at Faculty of Law at the Oxford University. So this meeting will be recorded, and after the comments by our distinguished commentators, we will have two round of questions from the audience. You are welcome to ask questions using the chat function in Zoom, and then we will give the floor to our special guest, Professor Ran Herschel, who is Professor of Political Science and Law at the University of Toronto and holder of the Alexander von Humboldt Professorship in Comparative Constitutionalism at the University of Göttingen. I'm very happy to host this book talk, and I give immediately the floor to our first speaker, Professor Mark Graeber. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, we first check to make sure the mute is off. The new world of Zoom. Thank you very much, Antonia. It really is an honor to be here and an honor to comment on this book. Now, many academics have claims to fame. Erika and Antonia can claim to be young leaders in the comparative politics field. Adrian and Tarun are established senior people, leading experts on both their country and the world. My particular claim to fame is I saw Rand Herschel first. 25 years ago, I was asked to comment on an essay, or actually evaluate an essay, allegedly blind. The first thing you do with blind review is figure out who wrote it. And the essay, which would eventually become part of Towards Juristocracy, was just remarkable. What I saw was first stunning erudition. The person who wrote the essay knew more about more countries, more about more disciplines than anyone I'd ever known, and could express this in clear, engaging prose. More important, what the author, Professor Herschel, could do was look at phenomena we all knew and told us we don't know the most important things. So in the late 90s, we were all celebrating the new constitutionalism as the great gain for liberalism. And Professor Herschel told us, no, this was actually a new form of elite empowerment. And when I go back and read the materials 20, 25 years later, this was the essay and the book that told us what right-wing populist movements were reacting to. And just a stunning achievement there. And now, 25 years later, 3 to 4 stunning achievements in between, we have a book that demonstrates all those qualities once again. First, the countries. I'm reasonably confident that there isn't an urban-rural divide on the planet Vulcan, because if there was, and it had constitutional significance, Professor Herschel would have talked about it. It's just remarkable, the number of countries. Remarkable, the literatures engaged in, and remarkable how clear the writing is. And most important, what Professor Herschel does in this book is looks at a phenomena we all know about, cities. Pretty much all of us live in them, and treats it in new ways. Essentially, what he wants to do is replace understandings of spatial federalism, which are crucial to almost all regimes, with the urban-rural divide, which he claims, and I think absolutely correctly, plays a far greater role in the constitutional politics of the second and third decades of the 21st century, and likely to play that greater role as time goes on. That he points out the political divisions of the world no longer map onto the divisions of most constitutions. So to take the Constitution I know well, i.e. the only Constitution I really know at all, the United States, which assumed that South Carolina was different than North Carolina and therefore merited separate treatment. That's simply not true anymore. That people living in New York City have more in common with people living in Chicago, people living in London, than they do people living on farms in upstate New York. And constitutions need to reflect that to some degree, the populist surge is a product of a malapportionment that leads rural places with far more power of cities, that in fact the rural places of the world get more than their fair share of political power, more than their fair share of government resources. And if we want to know where the reaction to right-wing populism is, it's in the cities, but few progressives, in particular, as Professor Herschel points out, few progressive constitutional theorists are talking about cities. We're all talking about populism. We're all talking about this check or others. Maybe if we had 6 Supreme Courts with checks and 5 other checks out there, we could stop right-wing populism, instead of talking about where are the votes that might overcome. How do we get to empower those voters there in the cities? So in this vein, when people talk about secession, one of the features this book does is it says traditional secession doesn't work because the spatial units that once seceded are divided among themselves. Should California secede, the same problems California experiences with the United States, Los Angeles and San Francisco will experience with more rural California. A second feature of the book, well worth noting, is Professor Herschel's longstanding concern with the global South. First of all, this book is unique in that not only does it mention the global South, which puts it in the top 10%, the mere mention puts it in the top 10% for references to the global South, but in fact, it speaks of a constitutional problem that is most prevalent in the global South. It speaks of the global South as the constitutional innovator, that where do we see constitutions taking cities into account? The answer is the global South, and it speaks of the global South as having something to teach the global North. So most of us are great believers that our country, and most of us are global North people, our country can teach what we call less developed countries. With respect to cities, in fact, it may turn out that what we used to call less developed countries have far more to teach the developed countries than developed countries have to teach the global South. Now, I do want to raise for discussion some issues. about empowering the cities. Professor Herschel talks about empowering the cities, and there's a wonderful story about a rabbi spends all day praying. People says, "Rabbi, what do you pray for?" And the rabbi said, "The rich should give more money to the poor." Yes, Rabbi, did they hear God hear your prayer? He says, "Heard part of it." He says, "How do you know that?" "The poor have announced they're willing to accept." And so I take it, the poor, the desperately poor in the cities are willing to accept. But I think as the project goes forward, and as many people here are students, Professor Hill will take the project forward, we need to consider some problems in empowering the city, and particularly empowering the desperately poor. The book emphasizes that cities have less power because of constitutional gerrymandering. Constitutions are structured in ways that give rural counties, rural places more representation than cities. But the desperately poor encounter three other problems, at least, in empowerment that the book does not spend the same time discussing. First, we know poor people vote less often than other people. So simply, even if you say you truly believe one person, one vote, the desperately poor do not vote as often as other people. The desperately poor do not engage in other forms of participation as effectively as other people. So to take one obvious point of view, the desperately poor do not make as many campaign contributions as more well-off people do. They do not even knock on doors as often as people with leisure time do. And the desperately poor have less access to accurate information than other people. They can be manipulated more easily. So problem number one is, even if we do go to a one person, one vote, even if we do empower cities, there still are reasons why the desperately poor are likely not to be represented with their numbers. A second deals with the organization of the desperately poor. Once upon a time in the United States and in Europe, there was an association that represented not the desperately poor, but the lower middle class, called unions. And unions were moderately effective in expressing the interest of the lower middle class against the upper class. Hardly perfect, but at least something. We live at a time where there is no good organization of the desperately poor in the inner cities, and in the absence of political organization, people are disempowered. And not only are the desperately poor not organized, the desperately poor are also balkanized. So Professor Herschel emphasizes that cities are a great source of diversity and multiculturalism. They're also a great source of tribalism. And one of the issues about empowering cities is you want to organize politics in a way that the desperately poor organize against the more affluent rather than organizing against themselves. And in this vein, consider one interesting thing worth pursuing, that I take it the desperately poor do want better housing. And Professor Herschel points out, in fact, when cities are empowered, you tend to get better housing. But I'm not sure same-sex marriage is high up on the issues of the desperately poor of Mumbai. What it does suggest is certain progressive political entrepreneurs are able to mobilize politics to achieve their cultural goals as long as they achieve a certain amount of redistribution. But the cultural goals may triumph. This is something Professor Herschel Rand has written elsewhere, but it's worth watching for it. The last thing, and a book that very much influenced me as a graduate student, Ira Katznelson's City Limits, is to be careful when we empower cities that city politics is not structured to pit the lowest classes, the desperately poor, against the lower middle classes. So, for example, there's a good deal of literature that shows in the United States, school desegregation, school desegregation was done in a way where what we really did was integrate poor neighborhoods with lower middle class neighborhoods, and middle class and upper middle class neighborhoods never had to worry. And the result was a politics where the lower middle class turned conservative because they were the ones paying the freight. So at times the book presents cities as clusters of the desperately poor and others of the nouveau riche, but in fact, the lower middle classes are missing at times, and the lower middle classes play a crucial role because if they can be persuaded to align with the desperately poor, I think you will get a lot of the reforms Professor Herschel wants. If in fact the nouveau riche can structure politics so the desperately poor compete against the lower middle class, we are likely to see only moderate reform in cities. And so this book is absolutely wonderful in focusing on the cities. I simply want to suggest the politics of the cities is likely to be tricky, likely to be a challenge, and that is, as Professor Herschel correctly points out, the challenge for progressives in the next 10 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. And now I give the floor to Professor Adrian Stone. Please, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Antonia. I'd like to begin by thanking Antonia Baraggia and Erika Arban for their leadership in organising this panel, and to express my thanks to the sponsors in the University of Maryland and the University of Milan. As president of the International Association of Constitutional Law, I'm really pleased to see the IACL has been involved through the research group on New Frontiers of Federalism. This is a pleasure, an opportunity to discuss Ron Herschel's fascinating book, City State, Constitutionalism and the Megacity. I had the privilege of reading it earlier this year before its publication, and I enjoyed the opportunity, inspired by this panel, to sit down again with it and reread some chapters before this event. So let me start with a few words of just outright appreciation. I think it has Ron Herschel's trademark erudition, clarity, and iconoclasm. The constitutional silence that Ron identifies and is the subject of the early part of the book, that is the near total disregard of cities within scholarship about multi-level governance, is startling. And the book is a compelling illustration of the importance of cities arising from their rapid growth, their social and economic power, the distinctiveness of their communities, and the social and economic problems that bedevil them. So the book is eye-opening and just bringing our attention to this phenomenon, and it would be worthy of your attention for that reason alone. But it goes just well beyond this into what I think is a very rich discussion of the many dimensions of the problem. And as I see it, they are at least threefold. There is first the political problem. As Herschel shows, the intersection of demographic concentration in many urban areas with constitutionally protected malapportionment leads to the systematic underrepresentation of cities. There is the fiscal dimension, that is the problem of vertical fiscal imbalance, drives some cities into the arms of business. Their limited capacity to raise funds sees them captured by private interests, vulnerable to capital takeover, and inclined to provide various forms of corporate welfare. And then there are the geographical dimensions. That is, some of the problems arise or have a particular shape or intensity precisely because of the geographic or spatial features of cities. And the book also presents a range of possible solutions that demonstrate what I think is some exciting possibilities for constitutional thinking to adapt to the problem, including ways to empower cities through better representation, greater powers of taxation, greater power to address problems in relation to public housing, environmental protection among them. So the book is really path-breaking in this sense, though it's pointing a way forward, and I have no doubt will open some new and rich veins of inquiry. Now, in the spirit of picking up just one piece of the book that really caught my eye and that I'd like to focus on, is that I'd like to look at the very interesting set of problems that are raised by density, population density in cities. Now, one of the reasons is that the information presented in the relation to density is amongst the most starkest and most unsettling in the book. As a resident of Melbourne with 1,600 people to the square kilometre, I couldn't help but be struck by the density of Dhaka at 46,000 people per square kilometre, and to note that there's even greater density in poor neighbourhoods, in some specific neighbourhoods in the megacities of the global south. Now, analytically, I think the problem of density is especially interesting. It has a different quality than some of the others discussed in the book. Some of the kinds of problems and challenges that cities pose could equally, and sometimes are, seen in other units of governance. So we can easily imagine times and places in which non-urban areas are beset by underrepresentation and fiscal imbalance. In fact, those are problems that do beset subnational entities in some formal federal systems. The density problem interests me because it presents a different kind of challenge to the theory of multi-level government, one that isn't just a version, albeit an urgent one, of problems already seen. Density is quintessentially a feature of a city. It's practically the definition of a city. And other subnational units will only have them to the extent that they consist of or resemble cities. So, this has been really the focus of my thought. And I just want to say that I think that there's a new direction in which we can take these thoughts about density. So no problem is ever really truly sui generis. And there's a way of looking at density that makes it an instance of a species of a broader problem. The focus on density focuses our attention on how space and geography affect the conditions necessary for the achievement of constitutional justice. So when we overlook space and geography, we overlook the conditions for constitutional justice. So that would lead you into at least two further research agendas. One is recognising that the problems of density probably need to be disaggregated over the different kinds of cities that we see. The book is illustrates very vividly the different levels of density you see in cities, for example, in the global north and the global south. But it struck me as also that they would have different capacities to deal with urbanisation arising from things like the pace of urbanisation and the wealth that allows them to plan. But it also struck me that there's another form of structural injustice that has a geographic or spatial dimension. And that is the structural injustice that arises not from remoteness, from density, but from remoteness. And this perhaps caught my attention because I'm an Australian. Australia is both geographically isolated from the rest of the world, and within Australia there are great internal distances. And the Constitution has been shaped in mainly unrecognised ways by what we call in Australia the tyranny of distance. The focus on structural disadvantage undertaken in relation to density led me to ponder the structural disadvantage posed by remoteness. And there are some clear analogies. It's easy to see how extreme remoteness makes it difficult to realise economic and social rights in different ways, but analogously to density. We can easily imagine how remoteness poses health challenges, interferes with educations, exposes populations to the exigency of climate change, and that these can be associated with remoteness in different but equally concerning ways, as they are with density. And just to give it a highly contemporary take, they're exacerbated by the pandemic. Remote communities do not have the technology and infrastructure to offset the effects of pandemic related distancing and travel restrictions, leading to even worse educational and health outcomes. And importantly, especially, but probably not only in settler states, remoteness is structurally associated with other forms of disadvantage, especially First Nations status. And so to return to the pandemic for the moment, it was instantly recognised in Australia that existing disadvantage of remote Indigenous communities, their poor health status and living conditions made them exceptionally vulnerable to COVID-19, and they have been among the most isolated by them. So that the problem of density can be paired with a twin concept of remoteness is illustrative, I think, of the deeper phenomenon that Herschel's book really powerfully illuminates. And that is that geography and space are themselves forms of diversity within states. And one challenge for multi-level governance is to think about how this form of a diversity can be accounted for. And of course, there are tools to do this, we just need to seize them, but it's helpful to think of it as a form of asymmetry, and that the theories in multi-level governments that have been developed to account for cultural and linguistic diversity might be a starting point for some fruitful thinking about the asymmetries of geography and space that has been overlooked. So let me just say in conclusion that I found myself at the end of this book reflecting that it had brought us to what was for me a surprising point. Despite rapid globalization of travel, communication, and rapid growth of supranational, transnational, and international government, the place where we live matters very, very much. And I have to say that I say this as a person who's been confined to 5 kilometres of my home for more than 100 days. But constitutional theory, the lesson of the book tells us, needs to grapple with the place we live and the great diversity of those places. And this is the path that the book presents to us. Studies of cities are one way, one important way to explore these ideas. But beyond that, the book has left me with an appreciation of the significance of attention to geographical space in the achievement of constitutional justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adrian, for these very inspiring comments. And now I give the floor to Professor Kaitan. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Antonia and Erika, for inviting me to this book panel. And I'm extremely honored and pleased to be speaking to Ran's book, not least because Ran is one of those extremely kind, generous scholars who've been in the field and still have no airs around them. When you go to a big annual constitutional law conference, there's some scholars you will see being trailed by a lot of younger colleagues trying to get their attention, and some who revel in that attention and find the time to especially spend time with them. And Ran is definitely in the second category. And having been a beneficiary of that benevolent advice and kindness, it's a special pleasure to be speaking to your book, Ran. So like Mark and Adrian before me, I loved this book. It's rare in our crowded field to find a completely new and original idea articulated so well that when you see it, you think, why hasn't anybody talked about it yet? And the book has that quality of stating the obvious in some ways, but its brilliance is because none of us had noticed the obvious until it was pointed out. And it's done with so much elegance and elan. And I totally second Mark's point about the comparative attention where the attention to the global south is not absent, which as a reviewer, I still see articles claiming to write about the world, but drawing from 3 jurisdictions, and no prizes for guessing which one those are. So it's not just that Rand includes the global south in his data set, right? But it's front and center and on its own terms. It's not even that the intellectual agenda is set by the north and the global south is just providing a greater data set. But this is a genuinely comparative, intellectually honest and intellectually rigorous work. So I'm very, very pleased to see it in print. So I have 4 broad comments. One is a big picture comment about what is the book telling us, and whether Rand might have been a little too cautious in outlining its implications. Whether it's more destabilizing or more fundamentally destabilizing than he's willing to admit. And then I'm going to offer 3 skepticisms about the argument. Now, these are not skepticisms on which I have a specific view on. They're hypotheses, more or less plausible ones, and I haven't done the research, but so I'm mostly playing devil's advocate. So here is the ambitious claim, which is that I think what the book showed to me was that megacities not just join the list of certain extremely fundamental problems that the current constitutional order, the current state-based constitutional order is struggling to respond to, but that it is also the intersection of a lot of these existing problems. And so Rand, you mentioned most of them in your book. I'm thinking about climate change. I'm thinking about inequality, but not just inequality within states, but also between states. I'm thinking about extremely gross human rights abuses 70 years after the United Nations and our commitments after the Second World War to not allow them to happen. I'm talking about migration, both within the countries, but also between states. And all of these problems seem to me to be not just problems that constitutionalism, state-based constitutionalism is fundamentally limited in responding to. That these are basically problems which require a rethinking of state sovereignty, which as constitutionalists we take for granted. And I don't have the answers, but I think that I would put megacities in that category of problems, which in some ways transcend constitutionalism as we know it, rather than, so of course, there's things that we can do within constitutionalism, and Rand has some very good ideas about that. But I think we need to think beyond state borders as well. So that was my first thought about this book. So here are my 3 skepticisms. The first one is a temporal skepticism, and this would not occur to anybody, I don't think, if we were having this panel in 2019 or 2018 or 2017, but 2020 is different. And it's different in ways that has put a fundamental uncertainty to what the future is going to look like. So despite the very compelling graphs that show that the trend is towards greater urbanization, greater urban density, growth of megacities just about everywhere in the world, I wonder if 2020 is going to recalibrate at least some of those changes and recalibrate in a fundamental way. So it may be that this is a flash in the pan, a vaccine comes around and this will go away, we'll be back to business as usual. Or it may be, as some scientists are predicting, this is just first of a very likely highly frequent pandemics that are going to strike us every 5 years. If it changes the way humanity has lived all this while, then we might be in a new type of world where urbanization itself has to be rethought. If remote working becomes more common in certain sectors, moving away again from public back to private transport, the attractions of cities that depend on density, all the cultural attractions and leisure activities, that may be compromised, and less concentrated infrastructure. Will states be less interested in investing more in cities? So how the pandemic pans out, I think, now, it may be that the pandemic may exacerbate and make some of the challenges that Rand points out even more urgent, right? So it may be that just as the rich left the inner city and moved to the suburbs, post-pandemic, given that the jobs that can be done remotely tend to be better paid, they will leave the suburbs and move to the countryside and do the remote working from there. Right? So some of the tensions and problems of inequality might well be exacerbated by the pandemic, and the cities can become perhaps even more concentrated spaces of relative deprivation than they have been so far, in which case the book will be even more relevant to a future. Or if the fundamental recalibration happens, but it happens differently, in that, the cities either lose their density or the inequalities are reduced. Maybe, we're seeing the left fortunes rising everywhere in the world. Maybe the problem will go away. Maybe I am an optimistic idiot, but I just think that there's a temporal uncertainty about thinking about this particular book in 2020. The second skepticism I have is a strategic skepticism. And I think Mark mentioned it in passing, I believe, in one of his comments. And that strategic skepticism is this, that while it is generally true that cities are more progressive than rural areas, I suspect, and this is, armchair sociology, I haven't seen the data on this, but I suspect that it might also be true that cities are more likely to be radical than rural areas, and especially radically fascist or radically authoritarian in ways that, so I'm just thinking about how in many parts of the world, India, Brazil, Sri Lanka, etc., we're seeing a progressive nostalgia for your good old-fashioned small c conservative as your nemesis, right? Who you can talk to, who you can deal with, who sort of works within the structures, who at least accepts democracy and fundamental rights. And, so I'm just thinking about the Indian example. Why is it that the fascist BJP is primarily an urban power? Why is it that sectarian violence, often with party implication, happens in big cities rather than urban areas? So I'm wondering that, all the reasons that make cities more progressive spaces, whether it's density, migration, connectivity, diversity, openness to new ideas, the social media networks, all of these things also make them more vulnerable to more radical politics of the sort that we may not like. And if that worry is legitimate, then how do we know that the benefits of constitutional empowerment of cities will be reaped by inclusive progressives and not by exclusivist radicals? So, translating this skepticism to some of your proposals, for example, so your arguments for more proportionate electoral systems, I'm wondering, to keep radicals out, perhaps we need more centripetal electoral systems like the alternative vote, the ranked choice voting system in Australia, which are designed to favor more centrist candidates. And a proportional system is likely to further empower radical forces. So the worry is that your proposals empower whoever holds the balance of political power in the city, but I'm not sure that they would always be progressives. So that's the strategic worry. And the third skepticism is a normative one. And this is on your point about one person, one vote. So we know, and Ron, you're the last person who needs to be told that that there are very good reasons, very good principled reasons why it is the right thing to do sometimes to depart from an equal vote, one person, one vote. And the primary example often given is some sort of consociational arrangement to give a measure of political insurance to a minority group, right? And deeply divided societies, groups that are likely to be locked out of power, who face a lot of hostility in society. Something, Sri Lanka is an example which comes to mind, where one person, one vote is probably not a great idea. Or you can think of Quebec or Northern Ireland, right? I'm wondering if a version of that argument may not also apply to cities. And this is turning one of your arguments on its head. So you talk about how lack of political power makes cities more vulnerable to corporate capture, and why therefore we need to empower cities politically. The flip side of that argument is that the way liberal democracy has worked everywhere, it hasn't managed to keep corporate power in check at any level of government. So what you might actually end up achieving by empowering cities is facilitate an even greater corporate capture of city level government by big business. So, so in some ways, if you were starting to design a constitution from scratch, you might actually have some reasons, I don't know if they're good reasons or not, you might have some reasons to think, okay, cities are where the economic and financial and corporate forces of the state are concentrated. That makes them extremely powerful economically. And I know that this is subject to the intra-city inequalities, but subject to corporate power disproportionately. And therefore, it's right to reduce their political power in lieu of their excessive economic power to get the democratic balance sort of right. And if so the argument is that if you in fact end up also politically empowering the city, then the city will not only be an economic behemoth, it will also be a political behemoth at the expense of people outside, but also within the city if the thesis about corporate capture of city governments bears out at any in any context. So I'll just conclude by saying, these skeptical hypotheses are not based on any research at all, and obviously more work is needed. But I think the mark of a good work is not whether you agree with it or not. And I actually am a sympathetic reader, and I agree with a lot of what Ran has said in the book. I think the mark of good scholarship is what it makes us think. And I think the one thing that is completely wrong for a constitutional scholar after the publication of this book is to not take megacities seriously as potential constitutional actors. And even by their silence, they're taking a regulatory position. So constitutional silence on megacities can no longer be thought of as a default position, but a strategic choice with important consequences and implications for constitutional governance. So thank you very much, Ran, for writing this book, and I look forward to your responses.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So thanks to all our commentators who have highlighted the richness and the multiplicity of issues that are connected with the status of cities and the constitutional recognition of the status of cities. If I may just start the comment. What I found very challenging about this book is the fact that it made me thinking about how the exercise of power, of public power, has changed in a post-Westphalian era. And so we need to think to the cities as one of the institutions that are exercising power. So we are no more within the Westphalian understanding of the modern state. We are in a new stage of this evolution, and this is particularly evident now in time of emergency. I was thinking about the reaction of cities like Milano, for example, vis-a-vis the exercise of authority of the state. So we really need to consider cities as a key actor in the exercise of power, even more, I think, in time of uncertainty and emergency as the time we are facing. So now I'm pleased to give the floor to Ran for his comments.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. Let me begin by saying how deeply grateful and appreciative I am to the organizers of today's event, to Antonia, to Erika. I've known both of them for several years now, and the future of comparative constitutional law and comparative constitutional studies could not have been in better hands than in the hands of these two dynamos and intellectual, intellectual powers in the making. And Tarun will have to excuse me that I classify him as more, in the myself, Mark Graber, and Adrian Stone. Maybe I'm wrong. In any event, I'm deeply grateful to Erika and Antonia for organizing this event. And we have two big-time bloggers here of the two giants of comparative constitutionalism, of course, ICONS and the IACL. Deeply grateful to Adrian, who is, it's basically midnight in Melbourne, so this is, I'm really appreciative. And Mark Graber and Tarun, I'm not sure where Tarun is based now. If he's in Melbourne, then special thanks. Let me try to say a couple of words. Obviously, there's no way I can address in great length any of the thoughtful comments. But I think since our audience is more interested probably in the general direction of the book and in the problems that it may raise, let me say a few general things, and then I'll try to quickly address some of the thoughtful comments. So the first thing I want to say is why I wrote this book. And this goes back to maybe what Tarun said, and to some extent what Mark and Adrian said. It strikes me that independent thinking and original thinking is one of the main benefits or perks that we have in our profession. To me, it's a vocation, really, not a profession. And I cannot think of too many vocations or professions that provide more or less institutional security to think independently and to look at the world as we see it and try to say something interesting and illuminating about it. And I've always thought that, at least to me, this is the most attractive aspect of our position in society. Not to say what everyone says, and just to say things or to look at things that we find interesting. And there are very few professions like this. And so that's exactly what led me, and you move from one big city to another, and then you begin to look at the literature, and you see that the vast majority of the literature in comparative constitutionalism has been caught up with this debate between Westphalian and post-Westphalian constitutional or visions of the constitutional order, while in reality, as all commentators said, all of us live in cities. And so it struck me as just too big of a gap not to be addressed by constitutional scholarship. The second thing I want to say is that this book is in some respect, at first, but there are some people, or there have been some writing on this, seldom in comparative constitutional law, more country-based, like cities in the US, cities in South Africa, etc. But I wanted to write more of an invitation for discussion rather than a conclusive, to the extent that anyone can write a conclusive treatise on the subject. So if you compare this to subjects that have been exhaustively written and researched and debated, there are very few works here that I could engage in dialogue with on this particular subject. So I had to resort to social science takes and political theory takes and some eclectic collection of constitutional writing from different countries on the subject. So I accept that like any first, to the extent that this is a first, it's an incomplete work that has the advantages, perhaps, if I may say so, of being bold and opening up a new area of research, but at the same time might have some of the disadvantages of a first, that it's incomplete and it has some gaps in its thought. And it's more of a, to me, an invitation for the community of comparative constitutional scholarship to engage in this issue and to even become aware of its significance. Another thing I want to say is on the, so just to recap that part of my quick response, cities strike me as extremely significant in everything we do in life, yet they have acquired, wrongly I believe, the status of, as non-canonical, or perhaps even anti-canonical concept in comparative constitutional thinking. And this is, to me, not acceptable, and we need to shake it up. And here I want to refer back to what Adrian said, the entire spatial thinking of constitutions and constitutional thought is locked up with concepts that have been around for at least 200 years and vary from one country to another. But we need to engage in some more serious thinking about density, about remoteness, about geography, about the place we live. And this book is more of an invitation to do that than a provider of conclusive answers. I want to say a word about the Global South aspect. So we've seen many treatises on why the Global South should be better represented in comparative constitutional literature from all sorts of reasons, normative, pragmatic, even numbers-wise. The Global South is 170 countries. The Global North is 30. So just that. So to me, the area of cities is one of the more interesting areas of constitutional law in the sense that South. And places like South Africa, Brazil, India to a lesser degree, but other countries, Mexico City or Mexico, Argentina, and other countries, Kenya, have been leading the way in terms of thinking about this problem. So this is not just, paying some, or just a token of appreciation to Global South issues. It is genuinely the source of novel thinking in this area. It's one of those few areas that I think the bulk of innovative thinking has been concentrated in the Global South. The last thing in that category that I want to say is the urban-rural divide. And everywhere we look, we see how significant the urban-rural divide is. And the time has come that we begin to talk about it in constitutional discourse. It just doesn't make sense to me that the political and social realities out there call to our attention in country after country, how significant those divisions are. And there's very little literature or address of this in constitutional thought. So with that in mind, just very quick attempt to address some of the rich comments by the three speakers and by Antonia. Obviously, I cannot do justice to any of this. I think what Mark raises, the problem of the poor and the concentration of the poor in cities is a major issue. And in particular, the potential pitting of the super poor against the very poor against lower middle classes that tend to congregate in urban areas. To me, so I don't have a good answer to this. It has more to do with intra-metropolis politics, and we have to think about the design of this, and I haven't done much in the book on that dimension. I should mention in that context that the big problem is the problem of the suburban. So one of the big differences, and Adrian alluded to this, between states and cities is that states have borders and cities do not. They have, of course, jurisdictional borders in some, in some office, but it's not borders, and there is no border control, and there are no passports, and there's no citizenship and stuff like that. So people can come and go. So the nature of the body politic is always transforming, and it's very difficult to determine who is in and who is not, who's member of that polity. And in particular, the suburban is very difficult concept to grapple with. It's easy to talk about cities and states, but in reality, we all know that the suburban has become a huge concept and of significance in the West, at least, and I suspect in many global South megacities as well. So certainly more thought needs to be given to the question of poverty concentration in cities. The one aspect that I address in this book in that context is concepts of fiscal federalism and how that needs to be rethought. So the concept of equalization and fiscal federalism and transfer of wealth across the polity is based on a concept of units, of federal, subnational units, etc. And the evidence is clear-cut. Socioeconomic gaps intra-metropolis far exceed across the board the socioeconomic gaps between subnational units or even within subnational units. So inside big cities, the socioeconomic differences are huge, and I provide some data on this in the book. But certainly Mark is correct that we need to think about the specific political sociology of the mega city, and that's an issue I do not deal with in the book. It needs to be it needs to be addressed. Adrian raises the issue of spatial thinking, and here I couldn't agree more. I think that intellectually, when I wrote this book, look, I love this, and to read decisions from South Korea or from India or from Brazil on the status of the city are absolutely fascinating. But I must say that the 5 or 10 pages I wrote about density in this book, I think it's in chapter 5, if I'm not mistaken. It's been a few months since I wrote it, and I hate to go back to these manuscripts after I finished them. But I think in chapter 5, I addressed this idea of density for 5 to 10 pages. This was mind-boggling to me. Just the data, the differences, as Adrian said, it's is in global South cities is not comprehensible how dense those places are. And just to think about the theory of density, if we think about it, what makes the city a different unit conceptually? So I talk about, super diversity, I talk about various other aspects, but ultimately it's this density thing. And the density differences, as Adrian suggested, throughout the traditional Westphalian polity is something that hasn't been addressed appropriately. And what I try to do in this book is scratch the surface of this concept, but I feel that just on the density itself, just on that dimension alone, on density and remoteness, just on that, there is at least another big book that awaits to be written by a major constitutional scholar. Just on that, how to design a new constitutional thinking of the polity given the tremendous density differences. And that's a major issue. I couldn't agree more with Adrian on the significance of geography and spatial thinking. To Tarun's thoughtful, friendly, skeptical thoughts. So, of course, there's a lot to what you say, and I'll need to think about all of this. My immediate thoughts on some of what you said is that although you are correct, of course, that there is potential of radical, I think you're alluding to right-wing radical capture of cities. Of course, there is potential for that. But if we look at the data, and I tried to look at such data, the majority of, perhaps even the vast majority of evidence we do have suggests that cities tend to be, on a whole, more progressive, more cosmopolitan, and more pro-distribution than the entire polity. And this may have all sorts of sociological and political explanations. On corporate capture, of course, you're correct. But my thinking here was more straightforward, that the less powerful a political entity such as the city is, the greater the likelihood for corporate capture. In particular, I devote some time to talking about lack of taxation, suitable taxation, and the democratic stakeholding aspect in that respect, and subsidiarity. And so, since cities' independent taxation capacity is rather low, but they are required to deliver the goods, so they go to corporate money. I mean, that's the most. So my thinking was more straightforward here. The more independent power cities might have, the greater the likelihood they'll be independent, or at least less dependent on corporate money to do such. But maybe it's too optimistic. But definitely you have a point, and we need to think about how to prevent corporate capture. Historically speaking, and that's an issue that I think some of the commentators alluded to, one of the reasons why the state fears the city is because historically, I mean, the density aspect here has a great potential in terms of spreading revolutionary ideas. And it's no chance, or fluke, that the French Revolution and many other revolutions in the modern era, just look at what we've seen in Hong Kong. Just look at what we've seen in Santiago de Chile, or in Tahrir Square in Egypt, and in other places. So the density aspect is not only important spatially speaking, it's important in the sense that the spread of political ideas in awareness and community and all sorts of other things is much more likely to happen when there is this dense web of interpersonal interactions. It's not just about super diversity. It's about, seeds of radicalism that are embedded in the urban situation, not to be overly poetic here. And so one of the reasons why the modern state, the Westphalian state, the Weberian state, the James Scott thinking like a state, you call it any way you want, is not keen on empowering cities is precisely because cities may be seen as potential competitors, as potential site of revolutionary thinking that may veer out of control the way if you see like a state, so to speak. So we need to think about all these things. Again, it's getting late, and I'm deeply appreciative that some of you are speaking to us from tomorrow. It's after midnight. So to conclude, I want to say that it's been a tremendous pleasure to write this book. It reflects to me everything that is good in being a free intellectual, and I enjoyed it. And it serves more than anything else an invitation. No serious revolutionary or innovative, I don't want to say revolution, innovative thinking on anything can rely on a single person. So it's an invitation to the community of constitutional scholars to take more seriously the urban setting that is around us and is only going, with or without pandemic, is already very significant in our political, social, and legal life. So it's more of an invitation for the community of constitutional scholars to engage with the subject, to think about it in a novel, fresh way, and to suggest new ideas on how to mitigate and address some of the problems I raise in the book. Of course, I'm again deeply grateful to all of the speakers, and I look forward to a continuing conversation on the subject. And I think, as Tarun said, my hope is that he is right, that no serious treatise on constitutional law from now on could ignore the urban or questions of density and self-governance to megacities, etc. I hope he's right. And on that happy note, thank you all. And I'm happy, if Adrian is still alive, I'm happy to take 1 or 2 rounds of questions.
Thank you very much, Ran, and thank you to our panelists for the very insightful comments. And so, yeah, we open up the floor now for some Q&A, maybe a couple of questions. To ask questions, you can use the chat box, the Q&A chat box, and I will read and moderate the discussion. So feel free to write down your question. And while we wait for the questions, let me just share some thoughts, some reactions to this book. I share with Ran an interest for cities. We over the past few years, we have discussed about cities. We have met in different places and discussed about this topic. And I was really pleased and happy when this book finally came out, because I think I read already 2 or 3 times because it is such a fresh and interesting reading, and it helped me immensely in properly framing some of the questions I had and some of the ideas that I had in this regard. I want to echo the comments that have already been made on the fact that this book is written really in a very beautiful way. It's so rich of in data and information. The book has many merits, of course, but I think that the main merit, in my opinion, of this book is that it forces the reader to think a little bit outside of the box. It forces the reader, the researcher, to look at cities in a original, in a novel way. And the book also offers some theoretical tools for scholars to engage and reflect more on this subject. So it's been really a pleasure to engage with this kind of work and this kind of research. And I really look forward to see how this line of thought will develop in the future, how other scholars will pick up on the many ideas that are presented in this book and how the research will develop in the future. So thank you, Ran, for this very beautiful book. So I don't see any question in the... Yes, now I have a question from Moritz Baumgartel. I'm reading it, a bit of a specific question, but perhaps it works. Herschel argues that the subsidiarity principle could be the basis for elevating megacities' constitutional status. However, when looking at the EU legal order, where subsidiarity is emphasized strongly, local authorities are actually very marginalized. Could Herschel perhaps comment on possibly centripetal impact of using the principle?
Yes, so I'm not 100% sure I get the centripetal aspect of the question, but I'm happy to comment on the subsidiarity element. And I'm definitely no expert on the EU, and certainly not when Antonia and Erika are in the room, and they know much more about the EU context than I do. I try to develop in the book a defense in a couple of pages of of the idea of subsidiarity and democratic stakeholding as one of the possible bases for granting cities greater power. And in general, the idea of the unit in federalism, and to what extent the discussion has been caught up with the subnational unit, while we need to think about cities and as a possible unit in federalism talk, in federalism practice. The idea of subsidiarity is well entrenched in the EU and in the constitutions of other countries. I should also mention that the EU has legislation concerning local government. However, that legislation is not very effective. So in some countries where there is, there are some political reasons not to adhere to that legislation, it is not adhered to. And another problem is that legislation does not, it treats local government. So that's another issue I'm talking about. Local government does exist in quite a few constitutions, but it does not differentiate between small villages of 500, 1,000, 2,000 residents and cities of 10, 20 million. So it's not, it just seems to me that size matters here a great deal in terms of all of the issues are raised. So if the person who asked the question or cares to elaborate a bit on what he has in mind, I would be happy to address some more specifics. But my sense is that in general, subsidiarity may be used, and it is, so what I try to do, let me just explain what's going on here. What I try to do in the latter part of the book is to draw on some already existing, not to reinvent the wheel, but to draw on some already existing constitutional concepts that may be invoked in the context of empowering cities. And in that context, I bring in the idea of subsidiarity that has been around, it originates from religious thought for like 300 years at least, maybe more, and then 400 years, and then it has been it's been invoked in constitutional thinking, of course, in the EU and elsewhere. So that's all I was trying to do, not to be overly specific, but I'm happy to address more specific aspects if the question is slightly more specific. Or maybe Antonia, who has been working on this issue of subsidiarity in the EU, cares to address that. So I regard the questions not just to me, but to the speakers in general.
I just add a very brief comment about it. So subsidiarity is an interesting tool, but even in Italy, we have entrenched the principle of subsidiarity. But of course, it not always it does work. And we are experiencing a high rate of conflicts between the different levels of governance rather than subsidiarity. So subsidiarity is something that is an important principle, but sometimes is made toothless by the interplay with political factors. And so
yes, so just on that, and maybe that addresses the question in more head-on. In some respects, and that follows on what Antonia said, subsidiarity is often used as a mask to suggest that, at least in the EU, that member states enjoy some power. It also goes with this margin of appreciation idea, etc. And in the American constitutional context or English-speaking constitutional context, some of the listeners would be familiar with the concept of community standards. The idea that in constitutional interpretation need not be necessarily based at the center, and it can get there ought to be some room for, moving away from the centrist interpretation of the Constitution. And so all I try to do in the book is not to suggest that the deployment of subsidiarity in the EU has been perfect. I'm just trying to say that along the lines of subsidiarity, democratic stakeholding, margin of appreciation, community standards. There's a bunch of already existing ideas in constitutional law that we can think of how to make useful in the context of city power.
Sorry. Yes, there was a follow-up point. I'm just reading a follow-up comment by Moritz. He's saying in the EU, the principle of subsidiarity is used to shield member state powers from the supranational EU level. At the same time, it seems that the principle in EU law does not reach all the way down to the local level, leaving total discretion to member states to decide on when subnational authorities can exercise their powers or not. I have another question or comment from Arun Chirovengadam. Does Professor Herschel focus on capital cities, which sometimes have a constitutional significance in countries like India and the US? The status of Washington, DC and Delhi, for instance, has led to constitutional controversies.
Yes, so this is, thank you. This is an absolutely fascinating question, and I grappled with this for a couple of months, what to make of the status of capital cities. So I do address this in the first part of the book, as Adrian said. I mean, the part that surveys the constitutional status of cities around the world. And it is true that about 60% of national constitutions around the world address in some way the status of a capital city, and in some cases like the US and India, capital cities, and of course Australia, and capital cities enjoy special status. But first of all, the constitutional protection of such capital cities is qua capital city, so it's part of the statist project. It's not; they are not protected qua mega cities. They are protected qua symbols of collective identity and national meta-narratives of the polity as such, often concentration of government, monuments, etc. Secondly, some of these capital cities, like Delhi and in, I think, Mexico City is probably, it's just unclear to me why people do not pay more attention to what transpired in Mexico City. So in 2013, the government of, we will save you all the details, but ultimately Mexico City, the constitutional status of Mexico City was shifted from a federal district, a la, say Washington, DC, to a status of an equal state in the Mexican federal system. And this is a 20 million at least city. There was a process, more democratic, less democratic, we can argue about this, of writing a new constitution to Mexico City as a new state in the Mexican Federation. A similar process, roughly speaking, transpired in Buenos Aires in 1994. There's also the opposite direction, and I address this in the book. For political reasons, Dhaka in Bangladesh has been, was divided into Dhaka North and Dhaka South to allow better control of the government over the city. And I think the most significant example in that respect, we can talk about Addis Ababa in the context of Ethiopia and the dispute over it. And we addressed this in a conference that Erika put together last year in Melbourne. I think the most significant example there is Nairobi, that for many years as a capital city was viewed as the center of power. And as a part of the new Kenyan constitution, essentially Nairobi was stripped of its preferential treatment. And there was this interesting process of decentralization and devolution in the Kenyan constitution. So definitely capital cities are addressed in national constitutions, but they are addressed as part of the statist constitutional vision, as symbols of unity and nationhood, rather than cities or mega cities that grapple with the urban situation itself. And we can compare this to if I just one sentence, perhaps the South African example, where this is probably the most innovative constitutional treatment of cities to date in national constitutions, is part of the apartheid or decline or demise of apartheid and move to a new constitutional order in South Africa. South African cities were granted constitutional status to some extent as a third order of government. So I think it's qualitatively different to talk about capital cities in constitutions and the megacity or even the urban setting in general in constitutions, as a different, qualitatively different type of political order.
I don't have any other question in the chat box, so I think we can draw this discussion to a close. Let me again thank the University of Milan, the Department of Italian and Supranational Public Law, the Laureate Program in Comparative Constitutional Law at the University of Melbourne, the IACL, and the research group on New Frontiers of Federalism, and also Gabby and Catherine, who have helped with the logistics of this webinar. And of course, I would really like to thank our wonderful speakers, Mark, Adrian, Tarun, and Ran, for discussing such a rich discussion on this very important book. And it was unfortunate that we couldn't have this book launch in person, and but by now we are used to Zoom meetings. I hope, however, that we will be able to meet in person again very soon and continue the conversation. So thank you very much. Thank you, Antonia, for helping with the organization of this event. It's been so great to see you all here, and thank you to the participants for their engagement and their questions, and looking forward to see you all soon. Bye.
Thank you and good night.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.